one that's not easily answered. So I think that, in my opinion, people may not take it as seriously as they should. It's a lot of folks think that because of their current situation, and even some very short-term planning, that they'll be fine. However, without really putting together what we would call more of a long-term or long-range forecasting, that we have designed over 30 years a comprehensive process called the Take Point on Retirement Freedom Plan. So this has been something, that's been put together proprietary of Take Point for over 30 years. And so, the number one concern is income, right? And that's the number one concern when folks are polled, will I run out of money? And so we have no idea if you're going to run out of money or not, unless we really dive in and do some very detailed, comprehensive, I guess would be the word of the day, planning. We've talked about this a lot on past shows. I think folks look at their very current situation and, it's part of our culture. We tend to just look at today and maybe forecast for the year, or, maybe look at even very short-term kind of planning, calculators on the internet. There's all kinds of tools out there. But there's so much detail that goes into a comprehensive income plan. We could probably take several shows to talk about it, but income planning. So I think the biggest challenge that I have with that, in my 30 years of doing planning with folks is it's very concerning to me, in a sense. Even people that I guess would have excess cash flow, or they feel as though they have plenty of income, they have a lot of assets, so they don't really probably worry about it, which I don't want people to worry about anything, but they don't really put together a budget, a solid budget. And it's probably 95% of people, and I know, all my retirement warriors out there listening to today's show, you're probably tired of me talking about this, but just like exercising, or, it's just a constant nagging thing that I'm just going to keep reminding you about, is that, you've got to budget, and nobody does it today. It's interesting. I think in the day, we're in this modern day era where, we're swiping electronic debit cards, and we're using credit cards, and we're not really writing checks anymore. And I don't know anybody, very rarely, I've got a few dinosaurs that still do it, that actually balance a checkbook. But, some of these people are probably in their 70s and 80s, but it starts with budgeting. I ask people when I sit down with them before we get into the numbers and before we get deep into retirement planning is, what are you doing in retirement? I ask folks, sit down for a second with your spouse, or, and say, what are we doing? What's retirement look like to us? What are our interests? Where do our interests lie? Because it's important, to have income and not to run out of money, but we've got to also take care of some of our dreams and goals and wishes in our bucket list, right? So hopefully folks have saved enough money to also check off some things on their bucket list. But you got to ask yourself, start having these conversations if you're 5 years out. I'm a long ways out from retirement. I'll probably just be semi-retired my whole life. I mean, I probably won't ever let go at Take Point, just because I love what I do. They'll probably be put me in my grave, right around my last meeting with folks, just because I'm so passionate about what we do. But I think I talk to my wife all the time, like, what are we doing, when I'm 65 or 60 and semi-retired? I hope to be semi-retired, where we could take some trips and do some things. And, so our interests lie in boating and fishing, and we're interested in doing some travel. And so we've got to have a budget for that. So when I'm doing my long range planning, I'm not just looking at what the electric bill is and how much we got to pay the pool guy, and what is our property taxes and things like that, and rent and mortgages. Most people, when they do a budget, it's not detailed enough. They come in and I'm like, hey, did you do a budget for me? After, like, I've asked them several times, like, please help me out here. We've got to have some type of budget.
Yeah.
Well, we don't budget. I'm like, well, I know you don't budget, but can you help me out? We've got to have some kind of number. I've got to do some forecasting.
Okay.
Because
I'm glad you brought that up, and I don't want to cut you off, but you mentioned number. You mentioned, and that's important, because mentioning budgeting, tying it in with a certain number, is there really a magic retirement number as it relates to budgeting when you're talking to clients?
I mean, you've always heard of these numbers out there that you should have 80%, at least 80% of if you're working and currently working and going through life, hopefully in retirement, they say you have 80% of your income, but it's just different. That's where we get into customization. I've talked about this numerous times, and I think that's the real advantage of working with an independent advisory firm that specializes in retirement planning, is that, you've got to look at things a little bit deeper and kind of ask yourself some other questions, as it relates to, not just taking care of the basics. So because, you may be able to live on 80% of your current income, but what about taking those trips? We all know, if you guys out there listening have tried to finance or have looked at planning a trip lately, a lot of people love to go to Europe and Italy and things like that, or take those cruises, and the airfare, just to get to where you're going. If you want to go to Hawaii, that's on your bucket list. The airfare is astronomical. So most people I talk to when we're talking about this, they want to at least take one big trip a year. That's kind of a common theme that I hear and see. So so that 80% rule really is not going to work for you. That's why we've got to dive in and really customize and talk about some of the fun things. And I think the other thing that's crazy that I hear all the time that I want to kind of caution people about is everybody thinks they know how long they're going to live. It's like, I'll say, like, hey, we need to factor out to age 90. They're, oh, I'm never going to live that long. And who would want to live that long, and all this kind of stuff. I hear all these comments all the time where they kind of chuckle at me, and I'm like, well, you don't know. I mean, you don't know when your last day is. You could easily live to 90. We have clients, in our 90s, whether in their 90s, I mean. And so, I just, to answer that question, it's kind of long-winded. It's really, to me, there really isn't that magic rule or magic number. That's why we've got to really dive in and custom